Good morning, students. This is for blog post 4.2, which is President Wilson and American Isolationism. This morning, we're going to talk specifically about why on earth America has not yet joined World War I. What could possibly be the reasons that are keeping America sort of in a lookout position instead of an active participant in the melee that's going on in Europe, and also trying to determine, are these reasons valid? Is there such a thing as protecting one's own resources and working for the good of one's own country than, say, for the good of the rest of the world? It all depends on your own value system and what it is that you value. Do you value certain things over national safety, or do you value, say, what you view as the right thing to do, and how do you even determine the right thing to do? And these are big, difficult questions that honestly aren't done with. People are still, and when it comes to foreign policy and the correct way to deal with foreign policies, we see a lot of these issues pop up again and again and again as our culture becomes increasingly more interlocking and global. There's hardly a situation in which isolationism is even an option nowadays. And so with isolationism becoming less and less of an option, you start to see these hard questions of, what do I do when I see something terrible happening? Do I need to go to stop it, or do I need to stay back and protect my own assets and protect my own self? Which is more important? These are questions that America is grappling with at this time. So we have just finished talking about the sinking of the Lusitania and America's response to that actual event. Basically, very intense, don't you do that again or else you'll be our enemy, and that's about it. And we also talked about essentially split reactions. Not all of the American public felt the same way about President Wilson's decision to keep us out of war in 1915. Remember, America did not join World War I until nearly the end of the war. They did not join until 1917. So at this point, at the time that America joined, we had, as a world, World War I had been in session for three years. This is difficult to justify and difficult to understand. Essentially, President Wilson ran on the slogan that America first. America's first, America's first, America's first. Let's first deal with America's securities, America's issues, before we start to look at systems and issues abroad. He ran for re-election in 16 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war and America first." So obviously he appealed to the idea that it is important that America looks out for America. And one of the ways that is possible is literally not engaging in a foreign battle that had very little to do with our national soil. There were three particular reasons that America could justify its lack of entering into World War I at its onset. The first of which had to do with a seemingly antiquated piece of policy called the Monroe Doctrine, in which we have looked at previously in our class. As you know, the Monroe Doctrine states that if a European nation intends on asserting itself in the Western Hemisphere, meaning on the western side of the world, America will see that as an act of war. Similarly, because the Monroe Doctrine was so successful in keeping European politics out of the United States' backyard, it was very, very hesitant to invite European politics into American daily life by literally taking ourselves into the European backyard. If, for example, if you have a backyard that's virtually free of anything that you don't want in it, you're not going to go and go get some more. You're not going to go to Europe and invite interference on your homeland when it has been thus far pretty much how you'd like it. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that America, even in 1914-15, we are a culture of immigrants, meaning that a lot of naturalized American citizens had incredibly close ties with their European backgrounds, and many families still had close relatives living abroad in Europe and living in their home countries, meaning that we had a lot of naturalized German citizens, we had a lot of naturalized French citizens, a lot of naturalized Italians, a lot of naturalized British. We had a lot of naturalized citizens that are in their home countries are now in conflict with each other. And President Wilson felt that it was imprudent to invite that sort of division on our home front. If we don't have to be fighting amongst ourselves as American citizens, that is best. And if we can keep from doing that, that is even greater. So, because of our mixed heritage background as a country, we decided it's probably not a good idea for us to take a side. And that would be the second reason that we remained isolated, again isolated by the Atlantic, literally an ocean separating us from the fighting itself. And the third reason is a bit more selfish. Third reason is we were trade partners with both the Allies and the Central Powers. And the Central Powers is the collective name for Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, all of the allies that Germany and Austria-Hungary had kept up until this point. They are known collectively as the Central Powers. And so because we traded and benefited from both ally and central trade, it was deemed in American best interest to not choose between the two and just continue to supply both sides of the war with what materials that they were getting from us. That way, we could continue to reap the benefit while they fought amongst themselves without having to take a side, without having to take a cut in our profit. The main resources that we were trading with them is food, raw material, and war munitions. So obviously we see this in greater effect in World War II, but if a country is at war, literally at war, there is less people, there is less resources divided to actually growing their own food and maintaining agricultural production. So we were literally feeding both armies. This becomes problematic a little bit later in the war whenever German blockades start to keep us from being able to trade effectively with Britain, and by us I mean the United States. So the tide begins to change, and even after the Lusitania is sunk and American lives are lost, we start to see a sense of moving away from our neutral position, and a clear preference from one side to the other is felt amongst the American people. And so this idea of neutrality, for these three fairly strong reasons, I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not you think they are valid, but lo and behold, there's still pretty strong defensible positions on why America remains neutral. They're not exactly universally accepted, not even universally accepted amongst politicians. Now, Wilson was known for his academic persona, his academic characteristics. He was known as an intellectual, very similar to the characteristics that President Obama embodied when he was sitting as president, known for his intelligence and his clear speaking and his ability to intellectualize thought. Very similar public persona as Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson's predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, did not have that same personality, and he was known as boisterous, pugnacious, and even warlike. And it's no surprise that former President Roosevelt strongly disagreed with Wilson's viewpoint of keeping us out of war. Roosevelt even went so far as to writing President Wilson asking that he be able to organize volunteer troops to go over and fight in the World War without America literally going to war. He felt so strongly that we should have entered into this battle even if America as a whole wasn't going to. He felt that there was a moral duty and that it would ultimately serve America best if this war were to end, or if we were just to enter into it and end it ourselves, essentially. Presidents Wilson and Roosevelt conflicted and contrasted on this opinion. But Roosevelt represented what a lot of Americans were thinking and feeling at that time. And in tomorrow's lectures, we're going to look specifically at a particular group of American volunteers into World War I that essentially felt like it was their moral duty to right a wrong that was apparent in the world. And so before we end with this lecture describing why it is America decided to remain isolated, and when we discuss whether or not the 3 reasons that they list as their primary motivations, before we just start to discuss, are these valid reasons, I want you to ask yourself, if I had to make this decision, armed only with the knowledge of what has happened up to 1915. Remember, we don't have our modern lenses where we can look back and we know how the war ended. We know what happens after 1915. If you had to make the decision based only on what we have studied so far, I want to ask you, would you tell America to join the war? Would that be your choice? Or would you be with Roosevelt to join the war, or would you agree with Wilson? Would you advise America to remain neutral as long as possible? What do you think would be what your actual actions would be? And I want you to ask yourself about these three reasons America stayed out, and ask yourself, are these moral? Are these amoral? Is it wrong to be self-serving in this way? Or is it just wise? Is it prudent, or is it selfish? How should we look at this? Or is it merely a matter of perspective and merely a matter of bias? These are questions that I want you to consider when we look at this particular lecture today. I will talk to you in class, and I really look forward to hearing what you think about America's lack of involvement in World War I at this point. I'll see you later, students.